Welcome to Doctrine of Dread, where lost photographs uncover their darkest truths. Today we reveal the haunting tale behind one of history's most mysterious images. During the spring of 1912, a picture was taken of a little girl, barely 7 years old, standing in a garden clutching a bouquet of freshly cut roses. Her face carried a grave look that appeared strangely mature for someone so young. The photograph bore a simple inscription, Eleanor, May 1912. For over 100 years, this picture remained hidden in the archives of the Blackwood Historical Society, forgotten among countless other glass plates from that period. The Blackwood estate had once been the crown jewel of Ravenshire County, a sprawling Victorian manor surrounded by manicured gardens famed across New England for their exotic blooms, especially their award-winning roses. The estate belonged to the Blackwood family, influential industrialists who had built their fortune in textile production during the late 19th century, a time when America's Industrial Revolution was reshaping the nation from a farming society into a manufacturing giant. Thomas Blackwood, the head of the family, was celebrated for his business skill as well as his fascination with photography, a relatively new art form during that era. The early 1900s marked an exciting age for photography lovers, as advancements had made cameras more accessible to wealthy enthusiasts. Thomas embraced this innovation with zeal, importing top-quality gear from Europe and studying the latest processes. He had converted a small room in the mansion into a dark room where he developed his own images, capturing the changing world around him. As America entered a modern age of progress, the dark room became Thomas's refuge, a space where he spent hours experimenting with chemical formulas and exposure times. The shelves were filled with glass bottles containing developers, fixers, and toners. A large sink with running water occupied one side, while a specially crafted table held the developing trays. The room glowed under a single red safe light that cast an unsettling hue over everything, turning the familiar into something almost supernatural, a fitting setting for a craft many still viewed as nearly magical. Among the countless photos Thomas produced were numerous portraits of his family, his wife, Lillian, his son, James, and his young daughter, Eleanor. Lillian Blackwood was a woman of elegance and forward-thinking ideas, active in the women's suffrage movement that was gaining traction throughout America. James, at 15, was preparing to follow his father's path, displaying a sharp interest in both commerce and the new technologies of the century. And then there was Eleanor, quiet, contemplative Eleanor, with her solemn gaze and odd behaviors that occasionally troubled the household staff. The photograph of Eleanor holding the roses was taken just 3 months before the entire Blackwood family disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and whispers that would linger for over 100 years. The vanishing of the Blackwoods in August 1912 shocked the local community. They had attended a summer garden party at a neighboring estate on the evening of August 17, 1912. It was one of those flawless New England nights, warm but pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the perfume of flowers and newly cut grass. Women in flowing white dresses and men in light summer suits gathered on the wide lawn of the Whitmore estate, sipping champagne and lemonade while a small orchestra played the popular songs of the era. Witnesses noted nothing unusual about the Blackwoods' conduct that evening. Thomas was seen conversing about politics and the recent Titanic sinking with other gentlemen over brandy and cigars. The catastrophic maritime tragedy, which had occurred merely 4 months earlier, remained a frequent subject among the upper class, many of whom knew passengers aboard. Thomas had reportedly been intrigued by the technical failures behind the event, questioning how such an engineering marvel could be brought down by something as primitive as ice. Lillian, wearing a new pearl necklace, spent most of the evening discussing the upcoming women's suffrage march with the ladies. She had just returned from New York after attending a speech by the famed activist Alice Paul and was full of zeal for the cause. Several guests later recalled her fiery advocacy for women's voting rights, a bold stance in the conservative society of Ravenshire County. Young Eleanor had played among the other children, though some guests later remarked she seemed unusually reserved even for a naturally quiet child. Mrs. Whitmore, the hostess, would later tell investigators she found Eleanor alone once, standing at the edge of their rose garden, whispering softly to herself. When approached, the girl smiled politely and returned to the others, but something in her expression unsettled Mrs. Whitmore, a look far too knowing for a child of 7. The Blackwoods left the party at roughly 10:30 p.m. boarding their Model T Ford, one of the first in the county, a testament to Thomas's love for modern progress. The automobile, still a novelty in 1912, had caused a stir when Thomas introduced it to Ravenshire. With its polished black body and shining brass fixtures, the car embodied the height of contemporary transportation. Having only been manufactured for a few years, its presence signified Thomas's wealth and forward-thinking character. The family chauffeur William Harper drove them the short 3-mile journey back to their estate. Harper later told authorities he dropped the family at the main entrance where the housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, greeted them. He observed nothing unusual in their manner, though he noted Eleanor had fallen asleep during the brief ride and had to be carried inside by her father. After parking the car in the carriage house, which had been converted into a garage, Harper retired to his quarters above the stables. The night passed silently, or so it seemed. The moon hung nearly full, casting silver light across the gardens and surrounding woods. A few estate workers later claimed they heard odd sounds, what one gardener described as singing, but not like any voice I'd ever heard. Another swore he saw lights glimmering among the roses long after the family had gone to bed. Investigators dismissed these accounts as imagination and superstition, especially in the wake of the baffling disappearance. The following morning, Mrs. Abernathy arrived at 6 a.m. as usual to begin breakfast preparations. She was a widow in her 50s who had served the Blackwoods for over a decade, known for her efficiency and loyalty, qualities highly valued in a head housekeeper. She entered through the servants' entrance, noting with mild surprise that the kitchen fire, which was normally kept banked overnight, had burned out. This was unusual, as one of the kitchen maids was responsible for tending it. Yet Mrs. Abernathy assumed the girl had neglected her task and relit it herself. Moving through the rooms, pulling curtains open and preparing for the day ahead, she noticed the house felt unnervingly still. That alone wasn't strange. The family rarely rose before 7. But the silence carried an unnatural weight, as though the house itself held its breath. When none of the family appeared by 7:30 for breakfast, she dispatched one of the maids, a young Irish girl named Mary Sullivan, to look in on them. Mary was new to the household, having come to America only 6 months before. At 19, she was bright-eyed and eager to impress, still amazed by the grandeur of the Blackwood estate compared to the Emple cottage in County Cork where she'd grown up. She climbed the sweeping staircase, her steps muffled by the thick carpeting, and made her way to the family's private chambers. Mary returned moments later, pale as the freshly laundered linens she handled daily. Her hands shook so violently that Mrs. Abernathy grasped them to steady the girl. "They're gone," Mary whispered, voice quivering. "All of them. The beds haven't been slept in." Mrs. Abernathy, not one to lose composure, went to see for herself. Indeed, the rooms were empty, the beds neatly made with crisp corners untouched. Thomas's pocket watch, always removed before retiring, still rested on his bedside table. Lillian's brush and mirror sat on her vanity, a few strands of her dark hair clinging to the bristles. James's school books lay stacked on his desk, a half-finished essay on the Industrial Revolution sitting beside them, and in Eleanor's room, porcelain dolls stared blankly from their shelf, the largest perched on her pillow, as if keeping guard over an empty bed. A thorough search of the mansion revealed nothing missing. Lillian's jewel box still held her valuable pieces, including her grandmother's diamond brooch, a family heirloom for generations. Thomas's wallet, with nearly $100, a fortune in 1912, remained on his dresser beside his watch and cufflinks. Even Eleanor's cherished porcelain doll, a gift from her father on her last birthday, lay perfectly arranged atop the pillow, as though awaiting her return. Their nightclothes hung in the wardrobes, suggesting none had changed for bed. Their evening clothes were absent, implying they still wore what they'd had on at the Whitmore party. It was as though they returned home and simply vanished, without undressing, without preparing for sleep. Only one odd detail stood out. The back door opening to the garden stood wide, swinging gently in the morning wind. Mrs. Abernathy knew she'd locked it herself the previous night, just as she always did. A trail of rose petals led from the door into the garden's heart, ending abruptly near a small ornamental pond. The roses themselves had been disturbed, several bushes crudely stripped, stems cut unevenly rather than with the gardener's usual care. The finest blooms, the ones Thomas had cultivated for an upcoming horticultural exhibition, were among those ruined. Authorities were summoned without delay. Sheriff Robert Miller arrived with 2 deputies at 9 a.m. A practical man, skeptical and unshaken by superstition, Miller had served 15 years as sheriff and prided himself on running a steady, no-nonsense department. His first conclusion was abduction, perhaps for ransom given the family's wealth. Yet that notion collapsed under scrutiny. No forced entry, no struggle, no ransom demand. And why, if kidnapping with a motive, seize the entire family instead of just Thomas or perhaps Eleanor? To spirit away 3 adults and a child without a trace seemed implausible. Officers launched a sweeping search of the grounds and neighboring woods, but turned up nothing. Bloodhounds were brought, given clothing from the Blackwoods rooms to catch their scent. The dogs behaved oddly near the garden, circling the ornamental pond over and over before losing the trail entirely. One handler reported his hound, normally calm and reliable, grew frantic at the water's edge, whining and tugging to escape as though spooked. The search widened to the nearby lake and river, with boats dragging for bodies, yet nothing surfaced. Neighboring estates were examined, inquiries spread to train stations and ports within 50 miles, without result. It was as if the Blackwoods had ceased to exist. One theory suggested Thomas, whose recent business expansions may have stirred enmity, had fled after receiving threats. Rivals, or labor agitators increasingly vocal in the region's mills, might have targeted him. And only weeks before, Thomas had enforced cost-cutting at his factories, dismissing dozens of workers, sparking small but loud protests. Yet this theory faltered. Why abandon all possessions? Why alert no family? And most puzzling, why had neither Thomas's brother in Boston nor Lillian's sisters in New York heard a word? No letter, no telegram, no warning. Another explanation, whispered in the servants' quarters, stemmed from something Mrs. Abernathy discovered that morning. In Eleanor's room, tucked between the pages of her diary, lay a disturbing drawing. It showed what seemed to be a woman standing amid rose bushes, arms outstretched toward a small figure resembling a child. The sketch appeared in red ink, or what some later dared suggest might have been blood. The strokes were crude and childlike, yet they radiated an unsettling intensity. The woman's arms drawn far too long, her face left empty save for 2 dark circles where eyes should have been. Curiously, the official police report contained no reference to this sketch, and Mrs. Abernathy would later deny ever speaking of it when questioned by Boston Herald reporters. However, Mary Sullivan, who had since left the Blackwood household and returned to Boston, was known to mention it after a few drinks in the Irish pubs of the South End. Over time, her retellings grew increasingly dramatic, eventually including claims that the drawing had shifted when observed directly, the blank-faced woman seeming to extend her arms toward whoever looked at her. Most dismissed these stories as the fanciful embellishments of a young, impressionable woman, perhaps craving attention or struggling to explain a deeply disturbing memory. Still, the tales fed into the eerie folklore growing around the Blackwood case, a mystery that captured the public's imagination like few others. As weeks dragged into months with no trace of the family, headlines gradually turned elsewhere. America in 1912 was charging into a new era of progress, leaving little patience for or enigmas without answers. That same year, the Titanic had sunk, rattling faith in human achievement, and the nation seemed determined to move forward rather than linger on tragedies and disappearances. The estate eventually passed to Thomas's younger brother, Frederick Blackwood, who showed little interest in the property and seldom visited. A Harvard professor of classical literature, Frederick preferred the company of books and scholars to the echoing grandeur of Ravenshire's halls. He announced early on that he would neither relocate there nor assume control of his brother's business ventures. Under this distant stewardship, the once celebrated gardens withered into tangled thickets, roses strangled by weeds and brambles. The mansion itself remained partially staffed, enough to prevent decay, but the vitality that had animated its corridors was gone. Rooms once brimming with life were shrouded beneath dust covers, belongings sealed away in trunks as though awaiting a return that would never come. Frederick died in 1938. With no direct heirs, the property was turned over to the county to serve as a historical museum. Most personal effects, including Thomas's extensive archive of photographic glass plates, were boxed up and stowed in the attic, left largely untouched for decades. Funding to properly inventory and conserve them never materialized. The Great Depression had drained resources, and the war years demanded every available dollar. Only in the late 1990s did serious cataloging efforts begin as part of a broader preservation initiative. Even then, progress was slow, relying on volunteers and shoestring budgets. Many of the plates had already succumbed to decades of neglect, images fading into oblivion. Fast forward to the present day, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a professor of historical photography at Ravenshaw University, was granted access to the Blackwood collection as part of her research into early 20th century photographic practices. In her mid-40s, Dr. Morgan had built a reputation for meticulous scholarship and an almost intuitive grasp of historical processes. She had authored several acclaimed volumes on photography's evolution from the daguerreotype to the digital age, focusing especially on the innovations of the early 1900s. Her interest in the Blackwood archive was primarily technical. Thomas Blackwood had been rumored to experiment with advanced methods, and his notes, if located, might illuminate amateur techniques of the period. She anticipated nothing more than a trove of family portraits and pastoral landscapes. While sifting through hundreds of glass plates, many clouded and fractured by time, she stumbled upon a photograph of Eleanor among the rose bushes. Something in the child's expression stopped her, an unsettling blend of innocence and strange, knowing depth. The technical quality was remarkable, clarity and tonal richness far beyond what one might expect from a hobbyist. Using modern scanning equipment, Dr. Morgan created high-resolution digital files for closer study. It was then she spotted something peculiar. In the background, swallowed by shadow and the limitations of 1912 photography, a figure appeared to stand among the roses, watching the girl. Initially, it could be dismissed as a shadow, a flaw in the emulsion, but when digitally enhanced, the shape sharpened into something undeniable. The silhouette of a woman in a long dress, standing rigid and silent among the blooms. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light, or damage to the plate. Dr. Morgan would later explain to the Historical Society Journal. Plates from this era often have anomalies, especially after decades of poor storage, but as I refined the image, adjusting the contrast, it became clear someone was there. Disturbed yet intrigued, Dr. Morgan enlisted the expertise of Dr. James Chen, a rising star in digital image restoration at the university's tech department. Dr. Chen had pioneered algorithms capable of retrieving detail from even severely compromised visuals, techniques that had revolutionized archival photography. His methods had resurrected forgotten faces from Civil War tintypes and breathed life into disintegrating silent film frames. Applying these advanced processes, Chen carefully reconstructed the faint form in Eleanor's portrait. The workflow required multiple stages, repairing emulsion fractures digitally, amplifying tonal separation to reveal hidden contours, and deploying specialized filters to isolate intentional photographic subjects from random artifacts. What we found was unsettling, Chen admitted. The figure resolved into the outline of a woman draped in a long white gown, typical of the period, but her proportions were wrong. Her arms seemed elongated, her neck unnaturally slender, and her face, though still indistinct, bore an indefinable wrongness, not quite featureless, yet not human either. The final enhanced image portrayed a figure that, while human in silhouette, displayed anatomical distortions so grotesque they defied reason. The arms extended almost to where the knees would be on an ordinary human figure, and the neck appeared impossibly long, as though drawn out by some unseen force. The face, shrouded in shadow, offered only glimpses, enough to suggest a mouth too wide, eyes too large, and set at angles that felt profoundly wrong. It was like an imitation of humanity created by something that had only heard the concept described second-hand. Even more unsettling was the figure's posture. It loomed directly behind Eleanor, one elongated hand hovering inches above the child's head, fingers spindly and claw-like, frozen in a moment just before contact. Eleanor, solemnly smiling at the camera, seemed entirely unaware of what stood behind her. As news of this discovery circulated through academic circles, it drew the attention of Dr. Rachel Sullivan, a noted paranormal researcher and, curiously, a distant relative of Mary Sullivan, the maid employed at the Blackwood estate during the family's disappearance. For years, Dr. Sullivan had been collecting oral histories and folklore tied to the Blackwood mystery, motivated by both professional interest and personal connection. Unlike most scholars in conventional fields, she approached her work from a perspective unafraid to entertain possibilities beyond the strictly empirical. With degrees in both anthropology and folklore studies, she held a controversial position in academia, respected for meticulous documentation of cultural beliefs surrounding the supernatural, but regarded with skepticism for her openness to the notion that such beliefs might have roots in truth. There were always stories about the Blackwood estate, Dr. Sullivan explained during her first meeting with Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen. The locals called it the Rose Widow's Garden. According to local legend, the property originally belonged to a woman named Evangeline Thorne, a passionate horticulturalist obsessed with roses. She was known for cultivating new varieties through experimental grafting and crossbreeding. Her creations became famous for their extraordinary color, a crimson so deep it appeared nearly black beneath certain light. For decades, Dr. Sullivan had gathered fragments of this legend, combing through brittle newspapers, parish records, and diaries, as well as interviewing elderly residents of Ravenshire County. The result was a tangled weave of fact and folklore where boundaries blurred. The tale went like this. Evangeline's husband died under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed she poisoned him using extracts from rare plants she'd developed in her garden. Others whispered that he abandoned her, driven away by her growing obsession with the roses that consumed every aspect of her life. Then came the blizzard of 1887, one of the worst New England had ever endured, a fact supported by meteorological archives. Snowdrifts reached second-story windows, temperatures plunged to lethal depths. When neighbors finally fought their way to the Thorne property, they found Evangeline's frozen body among the roses, arms outstretched as though reaching for something beyond sight. Her young daughter was never found. The most disturbing detail, Dr. Sullivan lowered her voice as if sharing a secret, is what the neighbors claimed about Evangeline's corpse. They said her face bore an expression of rapturous horror, an ecstasy laced with terror, and her arms were described as unnaturally elongated, stretched in ways the doctors later attributed to freezing. But the locals didn't believe that. The Thorne estate sat abandoned for years, its ownership tangled in legal disputes, its reputation darkened by rumor. Legends grew like the roses themselves. People spoke of hearing a child's laughter among the winter-barren bushes, of glimpsing a woman in white gliding through the garden at dusk. Parents warned their children, "Stay away from the old Thorne place, or the Rose Widow will take you." When Thomas Blackwood purchased the property in 1898, he dismissed these stories as rustic superstition. A man of science and reason, he dedicated himself to restoring the gardens and reviving Evangeline's dark roses, which had improbably survived neglect. Records even show that Thomas showcased several specimens at the New England Horticultural Society's 1901 exhibition, where they caused a sensation. Botanists marveled at their pigmentation, unlike any known rose cultivar. Thomas christened the variety Thorne's Midnight in honor of its original creator. Armed with these legends and the haunting photograph, the three researchers, Morgan, Chen, and Sullivan, resolved to dig deeper into the estate's hidden history. They secured permission from the Ravenshire Historical Society to examine every surviving record tied to the property: architectural blueprints, correspondence, household ledgers, anything that might provide clues. Setting up a modest base of operations in the county archives, they sifted through brittle, dust-furred documents. Many were so delicate that they required ultraviolet lamps and specialized supports to prevent disintegration. Then, in a stack of municipal planning records, they unearthed something unexpected. The mansion's original blueprints depicted a network of tunnels running beneath the gardens, ostensibly for drainage, a standard feature for grand estates of the era. But later revisions, commissioned by Thomas Blackwood in 1910, revealed significant modifications. "It looks like he expanded the system," Dr. Morgan observed, tracing her gloved finger along the yellowed vellum. "And here, this isn't just drainage. This is a chamber." The plans showed an underground space, accessible through a concealed entrance near the central pond in the rose garden, the same pond where the path of rose petals ended on the night the family vanished. The changes included strengthened walls, an air system, and what looked like electric wiring, a modern luxury that would have been quite rare for an underground space in 1910. The function of this room wasn't stated in the blueprints, but the amount of detail and money involved hinted it was meant for frequent use rather than simple storage. Further digging into Thomas Blackwood's business accounts uncovered large purchases of photo gear and chemicals during the same time as the tunnel changes. While Thomas was known as an avid photographer, the amount of supplies felt extreme for a hobbyist, even a passionate one. Especially striking were orders for chemicals not commonly used in normal photographic methods of that era, including substances more linked to scientific experiments than photography. With special approval from the Historical Society, the crew arranged to explore the grounds of the Blackwood estate, now a public historic park. The garden had been partly rebuilt in recent years, though none of the well-known dark roses survive. The decorative pond at the center was now drained, its stone bowl cracked with age and partly covered with moss and lichen. On a brisk autumn morning, the three researchers, joined by reps from the Historical Society and a county archaeologist, began their on-site dig. The estate had a haunting charm in the fall sunlight, the remaining garden structures draped in golden and crimson leaves from nearby trees. The air was cool and carried the faint smell of decay that comes with the changing seasons. Using ground scanning radar, Dr. Chen confirmed the presence of the tunnel system under the garden. The tech, which fires radar pulses into soil and reads their reflection to make pictures of underground shapes, showed a layout bigger than even the revised blueprints suggested. "The tunnels are still here," he confirmed, studying the radar scans on his tablet. "And there's definitely a big chamber, exactly where the updated plans showed. But there's something else too, another chamber that isn't on any plans. It's smaller than the main one, almost like an alcove or side room, but it absolutely exists." This find pushed the crew to seek urgent approval for a limited archaeological dig. Given the site's historical importance, the county sped up their request, and in under a week a small group of archaeologists started carefully digging around the edge of the ornamental pond. The excavation moved slowly, with every layer of soil removed and checked for artifacts. Just under the surface they uncovered bits of ceramic pots that once held roses, along with rusted garden tools and other debris common in an abandoned garden. Going deeper, they reached the old irrigation system, clay pipes that once carried water through the garden to feed Evangeline Thorne's and later Thomas Blackwood's prized roses. It didn't take long to find the entrance to the tunnel system, a stone hatch hidden under what was once a decorative statue of a cherub. The statue itself was long gone, probably taken when the estate became public property, but its base stayed, and beneath it, the hatch. The stone cover was heavy, built to look like part of the garden's ornate design rather than a doorway. It was shut with a detailed iron lock that had rusted tight over decades. After careful thought and talks with preservation pros, the call was made to open the hatch. Modern tools were used to gently break the rusted lock without harming the historic stone. It took hours of steady work before they were ready to lift the massive cover. The air that burst out as they raised the heavy stone lid was stale and carried a strange, sweet smell like roses. A narrow stone stairway led down into blackness. Bright LED lights exposed a tunnel lined with brick, its floor coated in a thin layer of dry mud and dead leaves that had somehow drifted in over the years. The crew moved with caution, recording everything with cameras and measuring gear. The main tunnel ran about 50 feet before opening into the chamber shown on Thomas Blackwood's updated blueprints. It was a round room about 15 feet across with walls of fitted stone. Wooden shelves, now decayed and fallen, once lined the walls. Among the wreckage, they found the remains of glass jars, photo gear, and chemicals for developing pictures. It seems to have been an extra dark room, Dr. Morgan noted, gently inspecting a partly whole glass bottle, more private than the one inside the house. But why would Blackwood need a hidden dark room under his garden? The underground room had features way beyond what a normal dark room would need. There were grooves in the floor that looked built to drain liquids, air vents that led to hidden spots in the garden above, and strangest of all, metal rings fixed in the walls at steady intervals like they were meant to hold something or someone. The answer began to show as they dug deeper. A smaller corridor led from the main room to the S&. Econ's secret space Dr. Chen had seen with radar. This space was much tinier, more of a nook really, and held a single stone stand at its center. On the stand sat a metal chest roughly the size of a small suitcase, shockingly well preserved despite the damp air. The box was brass with detailed carvings showing tangled roses with thorns that twisted into what seemed to be human faces in different looks of bliss or pain. The artistry was flawless, meaning it was a custom piece made by a master craftsperson. Unlike everything else in the buried rooms, the box showed barely any decay, no rust, no real tarnish, just a soft patina that hinted at age rather than ruin. The box was locked, but unlike the corroded hatch, this lock looked fully functional. After much thought and with members of the Historical Society present, they chose to try opening the box using a set of era-correct skeleton keys Dr. Sullivan had brought along, part of her antique collection. The third key they tried turned smoothly in the lock. Inside the chest, they discovered a stack of photo plates gently wrapped in fabric that had once been black, but had faded to a dark grey. Along with the plates was a leather-bound journal, its sheets yellowed but still whole, shielded from the worst damage by the sealed metal case. The journal belonged to Thomas Blackwood, and as Dr. Morgan slowly turned its pages, a chilling story started to come to life. The entries began in 1908, shortly after Eleanor's 3rd birthday. "My beloved Eleanor has always been unique," Thomas had written in a graceful, flowing hand. Even as a baby, she seemed to sense things beyond the usual scope of perception. Lillian brushed it off as a child's vivid imagination, but I have seen her chatting with empty corners of rooms, laughing and replying to questions no one had asked. Early entries described these moments with the cool curiosity of a scientifically inclined father observing his daughter's growth. Thomas noted that Eleanor began speaking unusually soon and would occasionally use words or phrases that felt beyond her age. He logged these observations with precision, as though conducting research instead of raising a child. Later entries recorded behavior that grew increasingly unsettling. Eleanor would wander in her sleep, always making her way toward the rose garden if not stopped. She spoke of the Rose Lady who visited her at night and whispered secrets. Thomas first dismissed this as bad dreams, but his doubt eventually gave way to dread. "Last night was the 3rd time this week I discovered Eleanor standing in the garden after midnight," he wrote in a summer 1910 entry. "When I asked what she was doing, she simply said, 'Listening to the roses.' When I pushed her to explain, she stared at me with an expression no 4-year-old should have and said, 'They're telling me about the other garden, Daddy, the one underneath.' I brought her inside and searched the whole house, worried that maybe one of the servants had been filling her head with old stories about the Thorn Woman, but everyone was asleep." Thomas's writing grew more anxious as Eleanor's actions became stranger. She started drawing obsessively, always the same image, a woman in a rose garden. The figure's proportions were warped in the way children's art often is, but there was a disturbing consistency to the distortion. The arms were always too long, the face always blank except for 2 dark circles for eyes. An October 1911 entry marked a shift in Thomas's account. "I have witnessed it myself now. I can no longer deny what I've seen. After weeks of Eleanor's insistence that the Rose Lady visits her nightly, I resolved to see this so-called visitation myself. I set up a camera in Eleanor's room, hidden behind the curtains with the shutter held open. At precisely 3:17 a.m., a glowing mist appeared at the foot of her bed, slowly forming into a woman in white. The plate captured her clearly, too clearly. What manner of thing is this? Not a trick of light or exposure. The figure stretched a hand toward Eleanor with impossibly long fingers. My logical mind refuses to accept what my eyes have witnessed. Later entries chronicled Thomas's deepening obsession with documenting the spirit. He turned part of the garden tunnels, first built by the property's previous owner, Evangeline Thorne, into a secret darkroom where he could work unseen. His notes revealed that he devised a special photographic emulsion he believed could detect spectral energy. I have mixed silver nitrate with select botanical extracts from E.T.'s black roses, he wrote. The resulting coating on the plates captures images that normal photography cannot. The process is dangerous. The chemicals are volatile and the fumes have caused vivid hallucinations, yet the results cannot be denied. The being that visits Eleanor is real, or as real as anything fixed by light and chemistry. Thomas's tone became more frantic as the pages continued. He began calling the presence her, or at times the widow, and his scientific objectivity collapsed into a mix of fear and fixation. He detailed attempts to communicate with the entity, first through Eleanor, and later using modified photographic gear he believed could not only record its likeness but somehow enable contact. The widow responds to the roses, he wrote, especially E.T.'s black strain, which I've successfully regrown in secret. When these blossoms are near, the manifestations grow stronger. Eleanor claims the roses are doorways that let the widow more easily cross into our world. Perhaps childish fancy, but the evidence suggests truth in it. The entity is clearest, most tangible near these blooms. The last entry, dated August 17, 1912, the day the family vanished, was especially alarming. Eleanor's bond with the being strengthens. Today she showed me a rose so dark it was nearly blacked. A shade unseen since the original thorn roses perished years ago. When I asked where it came from, she simply pointed to the garden and said, "She gave it to me," she says. "It's time for us to visit her special garden now. I fear we have trespassed into things beyond mortal reason. Tonight, when we return from the Whitmore's gathering, I will seal the tunnel entrance and destroy the photographs. Some doors, once opened, cannot be easily shut again, but I must try for my family's sake." The team sat in silence as Dr. Morgan finished reading the final words aloud. The meaning was terrifying. Whatever Thomas meant to do after the party, he clearly never had the chance. Among the photographic plates inside the box, they found the original negative of the image Dr. Morgan had retrieved from the archives, Eleanor clutching the roses. But there were others too, more unsettling pictures never included in the family's official collection. One showed Eleanor sleepwalking in her nightdress, her eyes open yet strangely vacant, caught by the flash of Thomas's camera as she stood at the garden's edge. Another displayed what seemed to be a hazy feminine form standing at the border of the rose garden, its proportions warped and inhuman. But most terrifying was a photograph taken in what appeared to be Eleanor's bedroom, showing the child upright in bed, apparently speaking with a barely discernible shape towering above her. A shape with unnaturally long limbs and a face that, even through the grainy exposure, radiated a wrongness that sent shivers down every spine present. Dr. Chen carefully scanned these newly uncovered plates with the portable rig they had brought for this exact task. Enhanced and clarified, the images were even more disturbing. The figure's face, now clearer, showed only the faintest trace of humanity. Hollow eye sockets, far too large and impossibly deep. A mouth stretched unnaturally wide across what should have been its face. This tied directly to the old legends about Evangeline Thorne. "Doctor," Sullivan murmured, her voice barely audible as they studied the enhanced images glowing on Dr. Chen's laptop. It was said her obsession with crafting the perfect rose drove her to unnatural practices. Some versions claimed she struck a bargain with something beyond this world, something that eventually claimed her and her child as its price. But these are just photographs of what? Double exposures, elaborate trickery, Dr. Morgan suggested, though her tone lacked any conviction. As a specialist in early photography, she knew creating such images would have been nearly impossible with 1912 technology, especially for an amateur like Thomas Blackwood, no matter how devoted he was to the craft. Thomas Blackwood was known as a rational, science-driven man. Dr. Sullivan countered softly. A man of his standing would have had no reason to forge such evidence, especially when he hid it away, and that doesn't explain the family's disappearance. Their debate was cut short by a call from one of the archaeologists still examining the main chamber. "You need to see this," the voice said, taut with a mix of excitement and fear. It was impossible to tell which. While documenting the chamber, they discovered a section of wall that sounded hollow when struck. Careful removal of several bricks exposed a small cavity holding a glass jar. Inside was a pressed rose so dark it seemed almost black, preserved astonishingly well, despite more than a century underground. The rose matched no species known to modern botany. Its petals, though dry and flattened, held a strange gradient, deep crimson along the edges fading to near black at the center. The stem beneath was unusually thick and armored with thorns that curved like hooked claws. Affixed to the jar was a slip of paper in a child's handwriting, "For Daddy. The Rose Lady says this will help you see her garden too. Come find us." This final discovery, combined with the journal and photographs, led the team to develop a theory about what happened to the Blackwood family. They believed that after returning from the party that August night in 1912, Eleanor somehow guided her parents to the garden, perhaps to reveal the source of the black rose. The trail of petals leading to the pond suggested they entered the tunnels, possibly reaching the hidden chambers where Thomas carried out his secret experiments. What occurred in those depths remains a mystery. The family vanished without trace, and no remains were ever uncovered. The case endures as one of New England's strangest disappearances. In the months after the find, Dr. Morgan kept analyzing the photograph of Eleanor with the roses using advanced digital enhancement. During this process, she uncovered a detail so faint it escaped earlier review, a detail almost invisible even at the highest resolution. Reflected in Eleanor's eyes, captured by the extraordinary clarity of Thomas Blackwood's lens, was not the image of her father behind the camera as expected. Instead, standing where Thomas should have been, was the vague silhouette of a woman in white, arms outstretched toward the child. The discovery chilled Dr. Morgan to her core. The principle of perking images, reflections recorded in the eyes of subjects, was well established in forensic photography. These tiny reflections often captured the scene before the subject, including the photographer. That Eleanor's eyes revealed not her father, but this spectral figure suggested either a sophisticated photographic illusion far beyond the means of the era, or something far more terrifying. That at the instant the photograph was taken, Thomas Blackwood was not alone with his daughter. This revelation drove Dr. Morgan to scrutinize every plate from the metal box with obsessive care. In each image of Eleanor, the same figure appeared, hidden in a mirror, in a window pane, in the shimmer of water, always there, always reaching for the child. Most unsettling of all was her analysis of the photograph of Eleanor holding the roses, specifically the roses themselves. Using spectral analysis software typically applied to detect art forgeries, she found the pigments in the roses did not match any known species from the period. The spectral profile was not even entirely consistent with organic matter. Whatever those roses were, Dr. Morgan later wrote in her published paper, they were no ordinary flowers. Their molecular composition, as inferred from the photographic evidence, included properties that defied all conventional botanical classification. The Blackwood case might have lingered as an eerie historical puzzle had it not been for what happened next. 3 months after their excavation of the underground chambers, Dr. Sullivan visited the site alone, reportedly to gather more data for her research. When she failed to return that evening, a search began. Authorities located her vehicle near the Blackwood estate, her research gear neatly arranged by the ornamental pond. The hatch to the tunnels yawned open, but despite an exhaustive sweep, Dr. Sullivan was gone. The sole trace was a faint trail of petals leading from the hatch to the center of the empty pond, where they abruptly stopped, a chilling echo of the Blackwood family's vanishing 112 years before. More disturbing still was what the security cameras recorded. The footage showed Dr. Sullivan working alone by the water at dusk. At roughly 7:42 p.m., she suddenly straightened and turned toward the garden as if answering a call. The cameras then show her walking toward a part of the garden where roses haven't grown in decades. For a fleeting instant, almost lost in the dimming light, a figure in a white dress seems to flicker between the shadows of the bushes. Dr. Sullivan moves toward this figure. Then both she and the apparition simply vanish from the frame. The investigation into Dr. Sullivan's disappearance is still active, but her colleagues Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen have since formed a chilling theory based on their findings. They believe that the entity whispered about in local folklore as the Rose Widow, perhaps the spirit of Evangeline Thorne or something else wearing her form, was never banished when the Blackwoods vanished in 1912. It stayed behind, dormant, bound to the garden and the underground chambers, waiting for anyone curious enough to awaken it. "There's a pattern we can't ignore," Dr. Chen told a reporter in a recent interview. "The entity seems drawn to people who develop an emotional connection to its story. First, Eleanor Blackwood, sensitive as children often are, and now Dr. Sullivan, who had studied the legends for years and carried a bloodline connection through an ancestor who once worked the estate grounds. Dr. Morgan, ever the skeptic, has resisted leaping to supernatural conclusions. She insists there must be a logical explanation for both the historical disappearance and Dr. Sullivan's recent vanishing. Still, she's urged authorities to seal the underground chambers permanently and restrict access to the garden until a deeper investigation can be conducted. "Whatever is happening at the Blackwood estate, it isn't finished," she noted grimly. "I'm reluctant to endorse paranormal claims, but the pattern and evidence suggest something dangerous is active here. Whether it's toxic gases in the tunnels causing hallucinations or something else, the risk is too high to ignore." Local officials remain doubtful of ghost stories, focusing instead on more mundane scenarios. They argue that Dr. Sullivan may have become disoriented in the tunnels, perhaps stumbling on an undocumented passage and vanishing into an unmapped section of the labyrinth. Ground-penetrating radar recently revealed the tunnel network to be far larger than anyone suspected, with sprawling branches stretching well beyond the old garden's limits. Specialist cave rescue teams have scoured the system, but so far there's been no trace of her. The search is complicated by the tunnel's instability. Many sections are so degraded they can't be entered without major reinforcement. In the middle of this grim investigation, a new discovery has deepened the mystery further. A distant relative of Evangeline Thorne, drawn by news reports about the case, came forward with a cache of preserved family documents. Among them was a journal belonging to Evangeline herself, dating from 1886 through 1887, the year of her death. Its pages painted the portrait of a woman consumed by botanical obsession, her life revolving around the dream of cultivating a perfect black rose. She described early breeding experiments in meticulous detail, but as the entries went on, her methods grew stranger. Evangeline wrote of folklore claiming certain flowers bloomed only in moonlight, plants said to thrive at the threshold between worlds. Most disturbingly, the journal included pressed specimens, petals, leaves, seeds, none matching any known species. Botanists who examined them were baffled. Preliminary DNA tests showed genetic markers alien to every catalogued plant genome. The journal's final pages referenced a ritual she intended to perform on the winter solstice of 1887, the night of the blizzard that supposedly claimed her life. She spoke of feeding her own blood to the roots of her rarest roses, believing this act would force the bloom she craved, a flower that could open a path to gardens beyond mortal reach. The last entry ended mid-sentence, breaking off after a single ominous line. "The roses speak to Charlotte now. She sits among them for hours, listening. Today, she told me, they promised to show her a garden where winter never comes, where roses bloom eternal, where we will never be sick." Charlotte Thorne, Evangeline's daughter, was long believed to have died with her mother in that storm. No body was ever found. Historical records suggest Charlotte would have been around then, the same age as Eleanor Blackwood when Eleanor posed with the roses in 1912, 7 years old. This coincidence drove Dr. Morgan to compare the few surviving photographs of Charlotte to those of Eleanor Blackwood. They weren't identical, but the likeness was startling, enough to spark unsettling questions. Could the two families have been secretly connected, or was the resemblance something far stranger? Then came another twist. Local historian Harold Jenkins, aiding the inquiry, uncovered a forgotten article in the Boston Evening Transcript dated September 3rd, 1912, 2 weeks after the Blackwoods vanished. The headline read, "Child found wandering claims to be Eleanor Blackwood." The story described a 7-year-old girl found alone near the Worcester rail station, 30 miles from Ravenshire. The child gave her name as Eleanor Blackwood and said she'd become separated from her parents. Police, aware of the ongoing search for the missing family, escorted her back to the estate. But when household staff, including Mrs. Abernathy, were brought in to confirm her identity, they insisted that while the child looked remarkably like Eleanor, she was not the same girl. The orphan was taken into state care and vanished from the public record. Stranger still, Jenkins noted, the article was retracted the very next day. The paper claimed it had been printed in error and that no such child existed. "I checked other newspapers from that week," Jenkins said. "Nothing, no mention anywhere else. It's like someone wanted it erased." Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen attempted to track down surviving files from the orphanage cited in the piece, but found the building had burned in 1923. Almost every record was destroyed. Of the fragments that remain, none mention a girl fitting Eleanor's description ever being admitted during that time. As their exploration dug further into these historical enigmas, bizarre events began to torment the team. Dr. Morgan claimed she discovered rose petals on her office desk at the university, even though there were no roses anywhere inside the building. Dr. Chen's digital tools glitched whenever he tried to enhance certain photographs, especially the ones showing that ghostly figure in the garden. Most unnervingly, both scientists shared dreams of wandering through an endless garden of black roses, guided by a little girl who never revealed her face. Despite these chilling experiences, they pressed on with their work, driven by academic obsession and worry for their missing partner. They concentrated especially on the upgraded image of Eleanor among the roses, hoping it might hide extra clues that could reveal the Blackwood family's fate and possibly help them find Dr. Sullivan. It was during this intense analysis that they uncovered their most terrifying revelation yet. Using advanced facial recognition software to match Eleanor's features with those of Charlotte Thorne, they zoomed into Eleanor's eyes at maximum possible resolution. What appeared made Dr. Chen actually recoil from his computer monitor. The reflection inside Eleanor's pupils, sharpened and enhanced, showed more than just the silhouette of the woman in white where Thomas Blackwood was supposed to be standing. It also exposed that the garden behind Eleanor wasn't the Blackwood property at all. The scenery, when examined at this extreme enlargement and through filters revealing details hidden to the naked eye, displayed a terrain that defied any natural explanation. Enormous warped formations that looked like plants but obeyed no known botanical logic, beneath a sky that seemed to hold multiple light sources where only the sun should exist. It felt as though the photograph had been taken in another realm completely. Dr. Chen whispered as they stared at the refined image, a realm only masquerading as the Blackwood Garden. Dr. Morgan, still clinging to logical reasoning, proposed that the photograph could have been altered by double exposure or some other darkroom trickery. Thomas Blackwood had experimented with photographic processes we might not entirely comprehend, she argued. These oddities might be flaws in his method rather than proof of something else. Their argument was cut short by a call from law enforcement. A new lead had surfaced in the hunt for Dr. Sullivan. A maintenance worker at the Blackwood property had stumbled on something strange while inspecting the irrigation lines near the rose beds. A camera. It turned out to be Dr. Sullivan's digital camera, partly buried in soil that displayed no evidence of recent disturbance, as though the device had rested there for years instead of mere months. When the authorities checked the camera's memory card, they discovered it stored hundreds of photos snapped on the exact day Dr. Sullivan disappeared. The last images formed a sequence that horrified everyone who saw them. The ornamental pond at sunset, a close-up of what looked like a lone black rose growing where no roses had blossomed for decades, a vague figure standing between the bushes, and at last, a string of progressively warped photos that seemed to capture Dr. Sullivan stepping closer to the figure. the camera apparently still firing automatically as she held it. The final image was the most terrifying. It displayed what seemed to be a garden, but not the Blackwood garden as it looks now, nor how it appeared in old photos. This garden was enormous, with paths winding through monstrous vegetation that resembled roses only in the vaguest sense, their petals the size of dinner plates, their stalks as thick as trees, all in hues so deeply crimson they almost looked black. At the center of the frame, barely visible among the colossal blooms, stood a woman dressed in white. Her back faced the lens, one grotesquely elongated arm stretched backward as if summoning the photographer to follow her farther into the impossible garden. Metadata from the device showed that this last picture was captured at precisely 7:44 p.m. on the day Dr. Sullivan vanished, just 2 minutes after security footage recorded her walking toward the shape in the garden before disappearing from sight. The discovery of the camera and its horrifying images drove officials to escalate the search. Yet as days became weeks with no trace of Dr. Sullivan, the probe steadily lost its momentum. Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen pressed on with their study. Though university administrators, worried about the possible mental toll of the case, urged them to distance themselves from it. Instead, they sank even deeper, especially after Dr. Morgan uncovered another link. While reviewing old weather records for the area, she learned that 3 major incidents coincided with rare astronomical alignments. The vanishing of Charlotte Thorne during the winter solstice of 1887, the disappearance of the Blackwood family in August 1912 during an uncommon meteor shower, and Dr. Sullivan's loss, which happened during a partial solar eclipse. "There's a pattern here," Dr. Morgan declared at a meeting with university leaders who were becoming more and more anxious about her research. "These alignments form what some cultures describe as thin places, moments when the barrier between realms turns fragile." The officials doubted her claims but consented to let the research continue under one rule. Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen could not return to the Blackwood property without supervision. They agreed reluctantly, shifting instead to dissecting the enormous cache of data they had already gathered. It was during this phase of concentrated lab work that they underwent their most harrowing moment so far. Late one night, as they scrutinized the upgraded photograph of Eleanor among the roses, the lab lights flickered briefly. When they steadied, both scientists detected a sweet, overpowering fragrance that reminded them of roses. On Dr. Chen's monitor, the image of Eleanor had altered. Though neither had touched the keyboard, the frame had zoomed tight onto Eleanor's face. As they stared in shock gripped them as the child's solemn face began to shift, her lips curling into a grin that widened and widened until it stretched past what any human face should allow. Then, with a movement that no still image should ever make, Eleanor's head tilted slightly until it seemed she was staring straight at the lens, straight at them. Dr. Chen lunged for the power switch, shutting the computer down. Both researchers stepped back from the desk, their scientific skepticism shattered by something raw and primal. When they cautiously restarted the system several minutes later, the photograph had reverted to normal, showing Eleanor in her original pose, no sign of the impossible motion they'd witnessed. "A shared hallucination," Dr. Morgan suggested weakly. "We've been overworked, sleeping too little. Our minds are deceiving us." Dr. Chen disagreed. "Hallucinations aren't usually shared in such flawless detail," he said, "and they don't leave physical evidence." He pointed toward the desk where the computer had been. A single rose petal rested there, so deeply red it seemed almost black. Later, lab analysis confirmed the petal didn't match any documented rose species. Its cellular makeup showed anomalies botanists couldn't account for, and its DNA, if such a term even applied, contained sequences unknown to any recorded plant genome. Most chilling was the finding that the petal's cells were still alive, metabolically active despite being severed from any plant, and they exhibited no decay even after weeks of observation. The university administration, now gravely disturbed by these events, halted the research project for full review. Both Dr. Morgan and Dr. Chen were put on administrative leave and strongly urged to undergo counseling. The photographic plates and every related artifact from the Blackwood property were locked in secure storage, and access to the gardens and underground chambers was banned indefinitely. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks into her forced absence, Dr. Morgan received a package at her home. It bore no return address, and the postmark was smeared beyond recognition. Inside was a single photo, not an antique plate or faded print, but a modern, full-color Polaroid. The image showed Dr. Sullivan standing in what appeared to be that impossible garden from her camera's last shot. She was smiling, looking healthy, unharmed, her expression one of utter serenity. Beside her stood a young girl strikingly similar to Eleanor Blackwood, clutching a bouquet of roses so dark they looked nearly black. Behind them, half concealed by massive rose bushes, loomed a Victorian-style gazebo with faint silhouettes inside. A woman in period clothing who might have been Lillian Blackwood, a man with a moustache recalling Thomas Blackwood, and in the deeper shadows beyond them, a tall, thin figure in white whose shape seemed subtly wrong. Scrawled along the Polaroid's white border, in handwriting later verified as Dr. Sullivan's, were 5 haunting words. "The roses are always blooming." Dr. Morgan immediately alerted the authorities, sparking a renewed investigation fueled by this shocking evidence. The Polaroid underwent expert scrutiny. No trace of digital tampering emerged. The film stock was authentic, its chemistry matching standard Polaroid manufacture. And yet, what the image revealed defied reason. Botanists concluded the roses belonged to no known species. Architectural specialists stated the gazebo matched nothing ever built on the Blackwood estate. Most baffling of all, atmospheric scientists analyzing the sky in the frame's corner reported what looked like 2 suns, an astronomical impossibility on Earth. Despite the surge of interest, Dr. Sullivan herself was never found. The Blackwood estate remains closed, though locals whisper of lights flickering in the Garo, dens at night, and faint sounds of a child's laughter drifting through the overgrowth where roses once thrived. Dr. Morgan eventually resumed academic work, though colleagues note she abandoned historical photography in favor of theoretical physics, specifically the study of parallel dimensions and non-Euclidean spaces. Dr. Chen left academia entirely. He now lives in an isolated part of Maine, cuts off all contact with former peers, and is rumored to have fortified his property with elaborate security measures. As for that 1912 photograph of Eleanor Blackwood holding roses, it lies sealed in a vault at the university, accessible only with special approval from the Board of Regents. Those few granted permission to see it describe an unnerving sensation, as though being observed from inside the frame, with the faint fragrance of roses lingering afterward. Local folklore claims that every 25 years, under certain rare alignments in the heavens, the roses in the forsaken Blackwood garden bloom again for just one night. Gigantic blackened flowers that appear at dusk and vanish before dawn. On those nights, witnesses speak of a pale young girl wandering the garden paths, arms laden with flowers, trailed by a towering figure in white whose proportions bend the logic of moonlight. Those who delve into the case caution strongly against visiting the estate during these nights, especially if a child's voice calls your name among the roses. For once you step into that garden, they warn, you might find yourself in a different garden entirely, one where roses never cease to bloom, where winter never comes, and from which there is no return. The photograph of Eleanor holding roses in 1912 persists as one of history's deepest enigmas, a frozen fragment of time that, under scrutiny, may reveal a doorway to another realm, a place where those long vanished may still roam among monstrous blossoms in landscapes never meant for mortal sight. So should you ever stumble upon an old photo of a solemn child cradling roses, think twice before you look too closely. Some images once seen cannot be unseen, and some gardens once entered can never let you leave. Shadow Frames returns next week with another forsaken image and the sinister truths it conceals. Until then, remember, every photograph holds a story, but some stories are better left untold.